Hi, I'm Arthur Haynes, and I'm actually just back from a collecting trip, a foraging trip to the mountains of western Maine, gathering a particular species of plant for food that many authors describe as a poisonous species. I thought this would give me a great chance to talk about dietary myths, and in particular I want to discuss today the paleo diet and some of the myths that have been incorporated into that diet by mainstream authors. This particular species that I was gathering in western Maine is called eastern black nightshade, and it belongs to a group of species that occur over the United States that are often referred to as the Solanum nigrum complex. And as you can guess from its common name, this species belongs to the nightshade family, which includes things like tomatoes and potatoes. Now, some paleo diet authors write that you are not supposed to consume members of the nightshade family because they were not eaten by indigenous people. This turns out to be false, and there are many examples of nightshades that were consumed by indigenous from right here on the North American continent. A great example is the plant that I went to gather. This group of species were eaten by several groups, including the Cherokee, who ate the leaves as a pot herb, which are supposed to be poisonous, but in fact aren't. And on the west coast, we have groups like the Mendocino and the Tabatalabal who consume the berries as food. What indigenous didn't consume is the modern cultivated tomato, because of course this was not widely cultivated around the world until the Europeans brought it back to their continent in the 1500s. Some paleo diet authors write that you are not supposed to consume salt because salt was not consumed by the indigenous people. It turns out that many Native American groups, in fact, did utilize salt, and this is not just limited to coastal people who had access to salt water. This particular salt, for example, is collected from an interior region spring, a brine spring, where the water is saturated with various minerals, including sodium chloride, which gives rise to this wonderful salt that you see here that we use in cooking. Around the United States, indigenous had many different ways of gathering salt from the landscape, and that included deposits of salt, as in rock salt, gathering from brine springs and using specialized salt pans to help evaporate the water to collect the salt. They also gathered from salt-impregnated sand and had a nice system of separating the salt from the sand using water and heat. And they also knew how to burn plants to get salty ashes that they could also use to season their food. In fact, if you look at the oral tradition of natives that are indigenous to my part of the world, the Maliseet, they have a story of one of their fit individuals who would travel downriver, great distance, and through neighboring tribes' territory to reach the ocean. And in that story, they describe a couple of different ways that they gathered salt from the ocean. So it turns out what the indigenous didn't have is refined and iodized table salt, because of course this is a refined food product that is very different from what we gather from the landscape as salt that contains an abundance of trace minerals. Many paleo diet authors write that you are not supposed to consume grains because grains were not eaten by the indigenous people. Remember that a grain is the fruit of a grass. It turns out that grains were consumed, sometimes only as a small part of the diet, other times as a very important staple through the year by many indigenous groups. An obvious example of this are the species of zizania, or wild rice, which were eaten not just by the indigenous in the Great Lakes area, but were eaten by many other people, including probably natives of the Kennebec River drainage here in Maine, based on their presence of a word for this species. Now, if we look around at various other species, we can see that grains were a part of the indigenous diet. For example, there are multiple species of panicum, or panic grass, that were eaten by western natives, including the Apache and the Hopi. And there's another species which had prominence in the diet, and that was Lamus condensatus, which is called giant lime grass, which was eaten by the Klamath, the Montana Indian, and the Paiute. Now again, what it turns out is the difference is that indigenous people did not eat genetically modified grains. They didn't eat wheat in this part of the world. And wheat is a poor choice as a staple for one reason: it contains 27 potential allergens, which is why some people have such a hard time on this particular fruit when they're eating it in the abundance that we do here in the United States. Another really important thing to consider is the fatty acid profile, especially the essential fatty acid profile. Wheat has an omega-6 to omega-3 ratio of approximately 15 to 1, whereas that same ratio in wild rice is about 1.3 to 1. Now, that high preponderance of omega-6 fatty acids in grains, remember, promotes inflammation and suppresses the immune system. So it turns out that indigenous did eat grain, they just didn't choose allergenic species. Another paleo diet myth centers on animal fat. And when people examine cuts of meat from wild animals, they notice them to be very lean, and they say that indigenous people ate lean meat. Well, that's true, but it's true because of the fact that fat is partitioned differently in a wild animal. Anyone who has ever butchered a deer, a caribou, or a moose, or some other large animal will understand that fat in wild animals is not usually marbled in the muscle like domesticated animals that are fed a high-grain diet. Rather, the fat encases the muscle and is just positioned in a different part of the animal's body. But this doesn't mean that fat wasn't available to the indigenous and wasn't consumed as an important part of their diet. In fact, a very nutrient and calorie-dense part of their diet. Now, another item that paleo diet authors often write about is that you are not supposed to consume any sweeteners because they were not eaten by indigenous people. We don't have to go to any other part of the world to identify the falsehood of this statement, because we happen to be living in an area that is full of maples where sweetened sap was collected by the indigenous, and through a series of different methods depending on the group, and these included things like birch bark buckets as well as hollowed out logs where heated rocks could be placed in the sap. They had various methods of reducing this down to create what you see here, which is maple sugar. Now, again, the difference is it's not that the indigenous didn't collect, process, and consume sweeteners. It's that they didn't consume highly refined sweeteners that have lost all of their nutrition. Using maple sugar and maple syrup as examples, we're talking about a sweetener that contains vitamins, minerals, and antioxidants. Now, you may say, well, they just didn't consume very much of it, and though that may be true over the course of the season, there are plenty of stories from the ethnobotanical records of men going to the sugar camps, these were natives of the Great Lakes region, who consumed very little other than the maple syrup that they were producing as a source of sustenance while they were working on gathering sap and reducing it down to maple sugar, which is a really important trade good for them, as well as a way of storing that wonderful sweetness and that nutrition that we get from the maple trees. And we see maples being used around the country. Anywhere they were large enough to tap, we see indigenous having tapped them to create a sweetener. And legumes provide yet another example of things that some paleo diet authors write you should not consume because they were not consumed by indigenous people, when in fact they were. And there are lots of examples we could bring up. Remember that the legume is the fruit of members of the pea or bean family. And there are, as I said, several species that we can call to, like the beach pea, the black vetch, as well as the timber milk vetch, are species that were eaten by indigenous people on this continent. So what am I trying to accomplish with today's video? Well, I'm not trying to dictate what you eat. What you consume, what you feed your children, or give to the guests that visit your home is your business and your business alone. I'm also not trying to trash the paleo diet or speak poorly about any of the authors of the paleo diet. In fact, any diet that recommends leaving behind highly processed foods filled with synthetic ingredients and return to a food that's rich in whole plants and animals that have been raised in a conscientious manner will generate health in a way that the standard American diet never can. What I am trying to accomplish today is to let you know that many diets and dietary paradigms can be based on incorrect information. Sometimes this information makes a big difference in the diet and your health, and other times there are relatively minor tweaks that can be done. But what we have to remember is you become the unwitting follower of this incorrect information that's been handed on. And in your enthusiasm and excitement, you may pass this information on as well. I would definitely recommend that any paleo diet author you follow, that they actually consume wild food. And not just buying food at the fish market or when fiddleheads are present in the supermarkets, but actually gathering the foods themselves. Because through the gathering, the processing, and the eating of real wild foods, the foods that come from our forests, lakes, rivers, oceans, etc., they will learn insights into the wild foods that they can then pass on to you.